What's the most inappropriate thing you've witnessed at a funeral? My father's funeral. After the service and the reception after, my mother, brother, and sister headed back to our family home. A bunch of my father's siblings and their family were also staying at the house with us. We got home a few minutes before everyone else. I was sitting at a table in the living room when I could see their cars come down the driveway. They all got out and were hugging and seemingly congratulating each other. The reception after the service was beautifully put together and was actually a fun time. A fitting sends-off for my father, so I assumed they were still just having fun from that, until they came inside. They all came in together very quickly and quietly. They came up to me and my older brother sitting at the table and kind of crowded around like a bunch of kids, about to see if they could have a cookie before dinner. My Aunt Barbara smugly stood at the front and asked, "So, when are we going to be doing the reading of the will to see what was left to us all?" My brother and I just looked at each other for a few moments before we turned to them to say, "Are you kidding? Reading of the will? Like a soap opera? There is no reading of the will. Everything that belonged to my father now just belongs to my mother." The look of defeat, but not shame, was disgustingly transparent. They were supposed to stay another few nights. They packed up and left that afternoon. He was a wealthy man, and the only one of his 6 siblings to make anything of himself. I think they thought he'd leave them all each a house, or a classic car or painting, or stocks and shares in companies, or just a couple 7-figure checks to dole out. And it wasn't all of his siblings, just 3 of them. The other 2 were incredibly wonderful people, and very close with us before and after my father. Story 2, my own kids. Boys ages 10 and 8. At their great-grandfather's wake, they got a chair and moved it to the casket and started making his mouth into smiley face, laughing the whole time. When me and their grandfather, my father-in-law, saw it, I immediately pulled them away and told them they shouldn't do that. Grandpa laughed and said, "It's fine. He would have really loved that they did that." We later found out that the great-grandfather had asked the funeral home ahead of time to put a sign in his hand that said, "Thanks for coming," but they refused. Story 3. At my grandpa's funeral in 2006, a random drunk woman that no one in our family knew stumbled in and started singing show tunes, then crying till she was escorted out. Story 4. An estranged uncle driving past my grandmother's funeral playing Another One Bites the Dust. To everyone apologizing for laughing or whatever, please don't. It's no longer a sore point for me or my family. That uncle was suffering from a mental breakdown due to substances abuse and a high-pressure job, and that combination eventually took its toll. It makes it easier to deal with than if he was just being a spiteful, as we thought at the time. Story 5. My step-grandmother died a few months before the Borat movie came out, so everyone was in full-blown Borat mode. Someone's phone went off and their ringtone was, "Throw the black-haired guy down the well." She, as well as most of the people attending the funeral, were all Jewish. Story 6. Only somewhat inappropriate, but certainly the funniest thing. It was a funeral for an uncle I was very distantly related to, and this is happening in Greece in the summer. The church is very full and incredibly hot. You can smell the sweat, there's incense. The air isn't circulating, and the priest is just going on and on. I don't think I can describe how grim the situation was. Not totally unexpectedly, therefore. Just as the priest is getting to something particularly emotional, a man, an old colleague standing near the back, faints. He's completely out. Now, this guy was very tall and rather broad, so not only was it a miracle that he didn't take out the 2 tiny old ladies right in front of him, he was also really difficult to carry outside to get some air. Somebody has the brilliant idea that the pallbearers, those people who carry the casket, should carry him, since they've practiced it and are reasonably strong. So everybody squeezes a bit tighter. Nobody wants to leave the church, things just got interesting, to let them through. They pick him up, 3 on one side and 3 on the other, that is more or less as they would the casket, and start carrying him towards the door. Suddenly, this guy wakes up, turns his head several times, grasps what's going on and who's carrying him faster than anybody can respond, and immediately starts yelling, "I'm alive! I'm alive! I'm alive!" At which point, one of the pallbearers laughs so hard that he drops what was thankfully a leg, and the others struggle to put him down in what is now a church absolutely exploding with laughter. The whole situation went on for a good 15 minutes, in which this guy walked outside, and the priest tried to resume the service, but there absolutely continued to be giggles throughout. I, being a teenager at the time, also couldn't possibly hold it back every time I thought of this guy yelling, "He's alive!" Nobody was even particularly upset because the uncle we were burying was always laughing and joking around, so it somehow felt appropriate that we had a great laugh at his funeral. Story 7. At my grandma's funeral. There was a woman that had a really bad relationship with my grandma, but one of my aunts invited her to the funeral. She started receiving people as if she was a family member and tried to put herself at the center of everything. Commenter 1. We had someone sort of like that, too. One of my cousin's girlfriends that everyone really disliked. I honestly don't think my cousin even likes her that much, but that's a different issue altogether. Uncle died, and she acted like her own father died to all my cousins' faces, who were incredibly close with their father and in completed devastation mode. Grandma died, and she did the same and tried inserting herself as the caretaker of everyone. Like, listen, read the room. Let me and my mother comfort each other. We do not want your comfort right now. Go bother someone else. Commenté 2. This is only tangentially related, but my grandpa died while I was in junior high. I was in drama, and he had helped build a lot of the sets for our plays. So I think my mom and teacher worked out that they'd tell the class when the viewing was they wanted to go. I'm not sure what happened next, but somehow word got around and something like half my grade showed up, not to the viewing, but to the funeral. There wasn't even enough seating, so you had like 50 teenagers just standing in the back of the chapel. It was the weirdest thing, especially since most had never even met my grandfather, and I'm pretty sure many didn't even know who I was. Plus, none of us could drive at that age, so somehow they all convinced enough of their parents to drive them to a funeral at a mortuary across town in the middle of a school day. I'm convinced that half my 9th grade class used my grandfather's funeral as an excuse to get out of school for a day. Story 8. At a family friend's funeral, a man I allegedly met when I was 3 came up behind me, pulled my head back by placing his hand on my neck, and told me that I might not remember him now, but I will someday. That creepy old banana fart. Story 9. At an open casket wake, a friend of the deceased attempted to give her a drink of single malt whiskey. She ended up being forcibly removed as she wouldn't stop and spilled a lot of the alcohol in the casket. It was as horrible and inappropriate as it was heartbreaking for everyone. Story 10. A relative of my husband died. There was a gathering at her house after the funeral, hosted by her husband. It was mostly family of my husband, but there were a few friends. There was catered food and drink, and people were just general socializing and telling nice stories about the deceased. About 2 hours in, a man and woman in their mid-20s show up. They are acquaintances of the widower. They walk around the house a bit, grab a drink, and then disappear. I was asked to get some more drinks from the garage, which was off the kitchen. I opened the door and stepped into the garage. There was the young couple leaning against a car and engaging in some pretty vigorous sexual relations. Another family member who was standing in the kitchen saw what I saw. I backed out of the garage because I was fairly embarrassed. I mean, who does that at a funeral? I guess the other relative told the widower because the next thing I know, there is shouting from the garage, and the widower is telling these two people in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave. Apparently, not only were they having sex in the garage, but they were doing lines of powder off the hood of the car. Only a few people who were at the gathering found out what happened, thank goodness. Story 11. I was at my then boyfriend's friend's funeral. Her aunt sat with me at the back and told me that she spontaneously lubricates at funerals. Scooched away real quick. Story 12. I witnessed the estranged drunk and addict daughter of a family friend come screaming into the visitation looking for her brothers because she had found out she was never written into the will. It was a hell of a scene. This was in Missouri. Missouri is an affirmative disinheriting state. They will, according to brother number 1, said she was actively excluded from the official will and entitled to no portion of the estate. Named her ex-husband a portion of the home sale. Brother number 2 bought his father out and kept it, and the remaining estate to both of her sons. The daughter was allowed personal effects, hence the police escort when getting them, probably to ensure she didn't try and swipe anything else. His mother had handwritten an unofficial one to be read to her children. Also, Ash had every chance to get clean between 16/18 and 27. Both parents were more than willing and able to pay for treatment. She actively chose not to, as well as actively chose not to seek treatment for whatever was going on in her life that caused her to turn to substances as a way to cope. She wasn't even going to come to the funeral until she checked with the lawyer the day of and flipped crap. Story 13. Not super inappropriate, but my grandfather was always a trickster. He had a great sense of humor. He had this little song he would sing to me, my siblings, and my little cousins where he would just repeat the words poo poopy doo over and over. At his funeral, my aunt was telling stories about him, and in the middle of her telling a story, my 6-year-old cousin screamed, "Poo, poopy doo," in front of 50 people. Needless to say, it lightened the mood a little bit and made everyone a little happier remembering him in a good way. Story 14? Not a funeral, but my grandmother was on her deathbed. She was going in and out of consciousness. My a whole father and his a whole sister start arguing over who will get her wedding ring. Not for sentimental value, but because they wanted to sell it. Anyway, to make a long story short, they took the ring off and their mother came out of consciousness. And the first thing she said was, "Where is my ring? Damn scumbags." Story 15. The mother of the deceased putting on a terribly acted and Met-fueled show about how much she loved and missed her daughter. Shortly thereafter, she was convicted of the daughter's murder. Story 16. My brother-in-law's girlfriend locked herself in a car, cried and screamed, threatening to take her own life at my father-in-law's funeral. She was fine 5 minutes later and explained to me-in-law she did it because she's not used to not having all the attention. She thought her being pregnant would make people forget that the father died. Story 17. My best friend died last year from a random heart failure at 25. The pastor at the funeral went on for about 10 minutes about how we had all killed him because we were sinners and that we should join his church to make amends. He didn't know any of us. It was very uncomfortable. Commenter: I'm so sorry this happened to you. I had something similar happen, not at a funeral, but at the viewing. Mutual friend of mine and husband's had died in a head-on collision. My friend had been drinking, but not driving. He had a DD. At the viewing, another friend's grandma was there. She sat up there the entire 2 or 3 hours telling every single one of us what terrible sinners we were and that we were to blame for his death, because if we had been good or even decent friends, he would be alive and would be a man of God. She was not invited to the funeral. Story 18. At my grandfather's funeral, the stand-in, curmudgeonly pastor kept calling my grandfather by the wrong name. Pastor, we are here to memorialize the life of John Smith. Pastor, John Smith lived a good life. I had never personally met John Smith, but my spouse loudly, well, I've never met John Smith either. His name was Bob White. Everyone attending burst out laughing. Story 19. The priest repeatedly referred to my grandmother by the wrong name. After the 4th or 5th time, my aunt got up and quietly told him the correct name. My grandmother had attended church weekly for decades. There was no reason for the priest to not know his parishioner. Needless to say, we did not pay his fee. Story 20. My cousin's funeral. He was 27 years old and killed in a single car crash after he hit a slippery patch on the road and smashed into a concrete wall. At his funeral, all of his brothers, sisters, and parents sat on the front row at his graveside service. Then, lo and behold, my cousin's ex-girlfriend of over a year shows up and immediately inserts herself onto the front row next to his sisters and proceeds to scream, cry, scream, wail, and throw herself on the ground periodically throughout the service. All of the family just gave her awkward stares, with no one wanted to address her inappropriate behavior. I had never seen that type of attention-demanding drama queen antics before or since. This was a funeral with military honors, Air Force, and they did the gun salute at the gravesite. I don't remember how many times they fire, but at each gunshot, she would literally shriek and collapse into the arms of either of the sisters standing next to her. I do recall at the very end, the youngest sister was sick of that crap and just let her fall on the ground, and it was raining heavily and rather muddy. Story 21. My sister's elderly Phil found out he had cancer and to take his own life. He wasn't one bit religious, but her husband, his son, had joined the Mormon church and decided on his own that the funeral services should be held there. The Mormon minister, who had never met the deceased, proceeded to hold everyone but me and my spouse captive for well over an hour, while he described in minute detail why we should all join his church and become Mormons. We got up and walked out on the sales pitch after 20 minutes. Damn a hole. Damn. Story 22. My ex came back from her grandfather's funeral. I had to work, with family reunion pictures of herself, her siblings, and her parents, posing next to the open casket. When I casually commented that I thought it was a little off, she explained that they did so because Grandma otherwise wouldn't believe he died. Story 23. Picture, if you will, 2 elderly women in a funeral, squaring up as people are still crying from the ceremony. At the lunch after my grandpa's funeral, his daughter from a previous marriage, Dee, who no one had seen in years, showed up. Dee had been writing bad checks all the way to the state prison and had definitely had some unresolved beef with my family when she got out. The last time my mom saw her was when was 11 and Dee left her infant daughter for my mom to babysit and never came back. Fast forward to the funeral. Dee is acting like it's a family reunion, but no one is having it since she's basically screwed everyone in the room in one way or another. My grandpa's last girlfriend, a legally blind woman, tried to physically fight her until others stepped in. The baby left with my mom at age 11 was not me, but that would be an amazing plot twist. Dee had said she was just having a night out and actually decided to run off to San Francisco. This was the early 70s, and left her baby. When Dee didn't come back, my mom called her mom, got a hold of a relative that took care of the baby until Dee could be reached. Sorry, I don't have a lot of details after that, but the baby grew up, and she actually arrived at the funeral with Dee, and I hear the apple didn't fall far from the tree. After the funeral, Dee tried to steal the car willed to Grandpa's blind boo, but my family thought ahead and a couple of my uncles waited around the house until Dee came for the car. They came outside and apparently she was scared off. Blind Boo got the car in the end and wrecked it immediately. I can't make this crap up. Story 24. I guess it's not totally inappropriate given who had died, but a group of guys lit up a fat joint at a funeral I went to. I guess it was his smoking buddies, but it didn't go over that well. Story 25 was at the funeral of a priest once. He was so well liked in the church. Not only were there dozens of other priests, but something like 2 or 3 bishops. More than half of the people had to stand outside of the church and listen via loudspeaker. And kind of hard when the neighbor of the cemetery plays anti-church and anti-God songs loud enough to hear nothing else. I'm absolutely not religious and usually listen to exactly the same music as well, but that was inappropriate, especially because the guy got up at around 8 a.m. on a Sunday just so he could duck with people. Story 26. At my great-grandmother's funeral, her son showed up to the funeral wearing khakis and his bright orange Tennessee Vols shirt. Then he started yelling at my mom when she asked him who the pallbearers were going to be, mainly throwing a fit about who was in the will. Mind you, we hadn't even left the funeral home yet, and were literally needing to know who they would be at that very moment. Needless to say, we don't talk to that side of the family anymore. Story 27. Oh boy. My time to shine. Former mortuary industry worker. The worst is hard to call because I've seen a lot. Some honorable mentions. A rando walking on off the street and proceeding to help herself to coffee in our bathroom. Didn't die. Did get narcaned. A couple fooling around in the casket showroom during the viewing. An angry old woman storming out of the bathroom with a fistful of tampons, screaming about how inappropriate we were for keeping them in there because there are children here. She threw them at the funeral director's face. They were kept in a cabinet, in a small basket, well hidden from a public view. She was definitely rifling around to have found them. We were no longer allowed to keep our sanitary products in the restrooms after this. A grief-stricken mother tipping her son's casket while wailing and trying to climb inside. Less inappropriate than it was terribly sad. Caught an addict relative digging deep into the pockets of the deceased, looking for, the family and it is assumed, money. A woman pulling down her child's pants and letting it crap in a potted plant. The funeral homeowner's horrible dog sashaying up to the front and taking a giant liquid crap in front of the casket, and horrified guests in the middle of the service. The same dog biting someone at another service. Tons of brawls. Lots of drinking. Biker funerals were insane. The women were meaner than hell and fighting one another constantly. The dudes were awesome, though. Super respectful, cleaned the place up perfectly, and even hauled their trash away, most of which was bags of beer cans and liquor bottles. I loved biker funerals. I have some, so many. But I'll stop here. Story 28. One of my best friends died in September. There were some questionable circumstances surrounding his death in that we were all pretty sure it was substances. Anyways, the guy that got him into the stuff, who shot him up the night he died, showed up to the funeral. Hi, I could have killed him. Story 29. Not sure if this counts as inappropriate, but when my high school classmate died, we were already in college. His ex, also high school classmate, came to the funeral. She cried so dramatically because she wasn't able to end things with our dead classmate on a good note that guests thought she was the current girlfriend at that time. Current girlfriend was left alone, sitting alone, staring blankly at the casket while relatives' classmates comfort the ex. Also, it got to the point that the boyfriend, can't recall if he attended or just got word of what happened, of that girl during that time got jealous and got angry because it looked like she cared more for the dead than him, posted a rant on social media. Story 30. My mom and sister were smoking at my cousin's funeral. He was only 16 when he died, so there were lots of kids there as well. My mom also wanted to surprise everyone by sending clowns to said funeral, who were going to paint butterflies on their faces because my cousin died of epidermolysis bullosa, known as butterflies disease. Story 31. My grandma died a few years ago and we decided on a burial. After the interment ceremony, the groundskeeper asked us if we would like to leave before they finished packing the dirt. My family said no. Cut to us horrifically watching my grandma's casket get repeatedly dirt punched by an excavator. It was more disturbing than inappropriate. Story 32. Maybe isn't as over the top as most of these comments, but I'm one of the Marines that has to go present the flag to the next of kin when a service member dies. It's usually old Vietnam and Korea vets, but sometimes it's a Desert Storm or recent war vet, and the mother is there receiving the flag instead of a son or daughter. Point is, I've probably been to 45 funerals in the past year. It's striking how often someone's phone goes off during the service. It seems nearly every other or every third service, someone's ringtone starts playing. There's been a few times where someone will get up from their seat and answer the phone too. Story 33. At my great-aunt's funeral in rural Missouri, open casket, small country church. The pastor says my great-aunt's dying wish was for one more person to embrace the teachings of Jesus Christ and to stand up right now and receive baptism in front of God and his congregation. Everybody's head swiveled in my direction, except the corpses. Nope. I'll just stare up at the ceiling for a while, guys. Thanks. Story 34. When my dad's mom passed away, there were a lot of people there. He comes from a family of 11, 10 now as his sister passed away a while ago. So there were a lot of nieces, nephews, and cousins. It was an open casket. I was around 12, 13, but everyone was grabbing things from the casket. All the aunts grabbing things for their kids who don't even know her, remember who she is. Way too young. The only thing my dad has a keepsake of his mother is a little rose pin that she wore in the home she was in before she passed. It's unfortunate and makes me feel very sad for my dad. Story 35. I know a little boy who said his first word during the moment of silence at a funeral. Great time to drop a toy and clearly say, crap, in context, right? Ripples of laughter went through the hall, like 200 people were at this funeral. Not a single person scowled or told me off. And one older lady came up to me and said, "You can be assured she would have laughed the loudest. She probably still is. That was quite the chuckle we all got." Special thanks to my oil field husband and my father for their chronic use of said word that led to this moment with my eldest loin fruit. Story 36. I've mentioned it before, but at the wake for my very young sister, my aunt started talking to me about how she was going to write children's books and gave me a pen with her contact information on it. I'm not sure what she wanted, but I write and edit, and I was working on an English degree, and we barely ever see her, so I took it as self-promotion, not offering ways to reach out. My mom threw the pen away. Story 37. A marriage proposal to the recently widowed. She accepted. I know this is a thing in some families where if a guy dies, a single male relative of the deceased will end up marrying the widow. Why this is a thing, I don't know, but no, it is. So, the divorced brother proposed to his deceased brother's wife, and she said yes. I doubt there was any cheating going on there. The two are still happily married as well. Story 38. A narcissistic family member arrived late, after everyone else was at the graveside for the burial, and probably lurking behind a tomb to pick the perfect time after the priest had just started talking. Wearing an enormous hat and sunglasses and low-cut gown, like she was attending the Golden Globes red carpet or something, and loudly making an absolute scene of how devastated she was, darlings, and just generally making it all about her. Story 39. I walk up to the casket to pay my respects at my grandma's funeral. My cousin walks up at the same time, and as we are both crying, she says, "It's just crazy to believe that 2 weeks ago, Grandma and I were smoking in your kitchen together." What? Story 40. I went to my uncle's funeral with my dad, sister, and friends. My father was already hammered, and my idiot friends dressed in t-shirts and shorts. To top it off, my cousin wore the skimpiest top to her own dad's funeral. My father, wasted, was hitting on his own sister-in-law. My cousin ended up inviting us to smoke medical weed in her car. It was a disaster. Story 41. My grandmother spent the last decade and a half of her life in a nursing home with severe Alzheimer's and depression after being kicked out of 2 other places previously for trying to die. Her last years were of weary terror, not remembering her children that would visit when they could and would ask only where her mother was and breaking down in tears when she inevitably realized what was going on, as little as she could. She lived mostly as a result of modern pharmacology and medical science with little to no quality of life. Before she passed, she'd agreed to have a priest from the church she grew up in come in and say a few words. Keep in mind, this arrangement was made nearly 15 years before she passed. On the day of her funeral, the big news story was the court battle over Terry Schiavo and the right of family to keep her on life support versus her husband's desires to remove her from it. For those that don't remember, the church got involved and made a major thing about how taking her off life support was akin to murder. Feeling the need to opine, the priest, who had never met her and knew nothing about her, took the cue and spent 10 minutes talking about how life support is part of God's plan and removing people from it is murder, and that the concept of euthanasia was legalizing genocide. The room was a level of deafening silence as no one could believe what words had just been spoken, what concepts had been advocated, what disconnect from the situation had been demonstrated. A man of the cloth was supposed to be there to comfort us in a time of distress and had instead insisted that the decades of pain and suffering of this poor woman were righteous and God's will, and how dare anyone should question whether mercy should have been granted to her. Never have I had to restrain myself more from getting up and physically removing someone from a room. When he was done, I stood up ready to go after him and felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "Let me handle this," was all he said, and walked up to the priest and lead him out. All I remember is hearing the priest say something to the effect of, "Is there a problem? There's still more I'm supposed to do," as he was being almost lifted off the floor by his arm and escorted out a door as my mom wept. The only thing I could think of was that she was denied the ability to have any dignity in her death and was now being deprived it even after her passing. A short while later, her casket was lowered into the ground next to her husband, who had passed 30 years before her. It was done without incident and without the priest. Story 42. My grandmother's funeral was on her birthday. I purchased happy birthday balloons because it was what she would have wanted. I was immediately reprimanded by my mother when I arrived as she forgot it was her birthday. But everyone that knew the family knew that she would have loved it. Even my grandfather laughed when I walked in with them. Story 43. Need to preface this with a little information on a regional thing from where I am. I live in Northwest Ontario, and we have these events called shags. It is a combination stag and shower for couples getting married. You sell admission tickets, 2 for $5. They take place in halls, and guests buy booze, tickets for prizes, etc. The money raised goes to help the couple start their lives together. And full disclosure, they are a damn good time. So on to my actual story. Not a funeral, but my grandmother was on her deathbed at the hospital. Extended family was coming and going to say their goodbyes. My dad's cousin came by and did the usual, I'm sorry, thoughts are with you, say, sadness all around. Then this cousin of my dad starts to ask everyone if they want to buy tickets to his upcoming shag. We are in her hospital room, watching her slowly die, and this a hole, who is in his 50s and way past the acceptable age to even be holding a shag, is asking people to buy tickets off him for his shag. Idiots didn't take the hints when everyone kept saying, no, not right now, just kept asking. I'm not a violent man, but at that point I was as close as I have ever been to cold cocking someone. 5 years later, this still angers us. Story 44. This was inadvertently inappropriate and kind of a funny story that happened at my friend's dad's funeral. His dad had just died from a terminal illness after fighting for a few years, and me and another friend went to funeral to pay our respects and be there for the family. We got there a little early and met up with my friend, his girlfriend, and his brother or girlfriend in the church's entryway. There was a wedding finishing up there, so we had to wait, and we just stood there waiting to set things up. The wedding finally lets out, and we see the guests rolling out, followed by the wedding party. All of the bridesmaids and groomsmen were dressed in full Adidas tracksuits and sneakers. Then the bride and groom make their appearance, and she is wearing a pink wedding dress with a pair of Adidas and a track jacket over the dress. The groom is wearing a white Adidas tracksuit with a matching hat. They both walk out hand in hand doing the sea walk dance and trying to hand us these party poppers, which we politely declined. I think they saw the memorial posters and realized that we were there for a funeral because they stopped dancing, straightened up, and hurried outside. I looked at my friend and we couldn't help but laugh at the situation. Those people were doing their thing and having fun, and it certainly lightened the mood of a very sad day, which is what his dad would have wanted. Story 45. A good friend of mine we used to hang out a lot. Then she just stopped coming around. A few months later, found out she had died. Went to the funeral. The guy that got her into all the substances and stuff was there. We could put something in the casket if we wanted. He went up and put a Hatchet Man sticker on her coffin. Hatchet Man and the cause of her death. Seriously? I damn wanted to murder him right then and there. I was 17 at the time. Story 46. I worked at a cemetery one summer when I was in high school. This usually involved mowing, but they also had me help on the setup, tear down of burial equipment. The worst I saw was just a screaming argument that appeared to be sibling upset one took advantage of their now deceased mother. The most interesting thing was observing how culturally different groups handled the burial. White families always left right after the preacher was finished, so we would lower the coffin with everyone gone. Black families always stayed until the dirt started going on top. Only had one Asian funeral, and it was a cremation. Story 47. We went out to dinner after my dad's funeral. I had snagged one of his hoodies from his closet, and I was wearing it. My brother noticed and kind of sarcastically said, "Hey, nice jacket." I said, "Thanks. I got it off a dead guy." Story 48. My partner's stepmom's funeral. I was standing next to my partner to support him when one of his distant relatives, before even giving condolences or a greeting or anything else, asked, "Are you two married?" "No." "Oh, but you're together." "Yes." What a shame. The same woman then approached us at the wake and started going on about how nice it was to see young love blossom after a family breakup and how exotic I was. I'm Asian, he's white, because my partner had broken up with the mother of his child. She heavily implied that I was just a rebound and that he would be back to his normal self soon. When my partner corrected her and told her that we had been together for 5 years, she visibly became uncomfortable and said, "Oh, how nice." Story 49. A kid doing a Fortnite dance. It was a relative of my mother who died. He was a nice guy who worked hard and helped people outside. Along comes his nephew, and instead of paying his respects or just standing like a normal human, he gets right next to the coffin and does a Fortnite dance. This made me think genocidal thoughts. Story 50. My grandmother, 52 at the time, died due to a botched surgery where they cut a major artery by accident. Her mother was in her late 70s and could not believe she lost her daughter. She was showing early signs of dementia before this, and her death didn't help. During the eulogy, my great-grandmother jumped up and said, "She blinked! I saw it! She's not dead!" and attempted to run up and pull her from the coffin. Story 51. I had a guy that I don't know walk up behind me and my dad during my grandma's funeral. They were lowering the casket at that moment. This jackass put his arms around both of us, and I looked back. Everyone was wearing black, obviously, except this. He was wearing American flag pajama bottoms and a red shirt with the sleeves cut off. He looks at both of us and says, "Cheer up, guys." My dad and I are not violent, but we had to eye-talk each other down from turning around and dual punching the git on the jaw. I know, not the most inappropriate thing ever, but at that moment it felt like it. Stupid git. Story 52. At my grandmother's funeral. She only had 3 blood relations left in the world, myself included. Her second husband's family did not allow any of us to be part of the planning. They wouldn't let us sit in the family pew and wouldn't let us give farewell words during the service. A family friend kicked other people out of a pew near the front at least. I nearly lost my crap during the eulogy when the pastor stated she enjoyed plunking on the piano, the same piano she never touched and threatened to take an axe to on a near-daily basis due to all the damn dust it collected at the grave. Each of the blood relations laid a rose on the casket, and multiple people attending said, "Who are they and why are they even here?" Almost as an afterthought, we were invited to my grandmother's home after the burial, which caused many puzzled looks from attendees as to why we would be invited. I noted the hell out of that to give the woman the send-off she would have actually wanted, with alcohol and friends. Story 53. A keg party on Grandma's porch to celebrate her life. The entire family were known to be a-holes who became bigger a-holes when they drank. Pretty much everyone outside the family stayed away from that section of the small town during this event. Years later, grandson number 1 lost his half-brother to a car wreck after feeding him booze at his place. He never got charged for supplying alcohol to a minor and has never accepted responsibility for the accident. Crap ripped my small town to pieces. The kid was well-loved and a great guy. Guess what they did to celebrate his life? Story 54. A 15-year-old girl came to her cousin's funeral in booty shorts and a shirt that had almost no back, just some straps that held the front together. You could see the entirety of the back of her bra. It looked like something you would wear to a club. Her parents were dressed in a full suit and dress. I don't know why they let her go like that, but whatever. Also, same funeral, the mother of the person who passed away refused to show up because she hated her ex-husband and his new wife. She snuck in halfway through and they ended up fighting in the parking lot after the ceremony. Story 55. Oh no, I'm late to this one, so this will get buried, but I have a real good one. So my uncle, who is not well liked in the family, passes away. He was notoriously mean to his children through verbal and physical abuse, a loner, and a man who would generally look for any excuse to argue. Anyways, at his funeral, everything is going well, lots of real sad, lots of fake sad. When there is a moment of everyone being quiet remembering the man, he was when Bam, his son, my cousin, comes barging through the doors with a single first raised in the air. Everyone turns and looks at him as he triumphantly exclaims, "Rejoice, the tyrant is dead," turns around and waltzes out of the room like nothing ever happened. Story 56. Happened last month at my grandma's funeral. I knew my elusive bio-dad would be there with his crazy foreign wife. They have been together for 10 plus years, and within that time, she's managed to totally isolate him from his entire family, including me. He left my mom when I was 1, so it's nothing new. But this is different. He's not allowed to call me, and emails me occasionally on a private line. In fact, the last time I saw him was at my cousin's funeral 5 years ago. Anyway, everyone was obviously here to celebrate the life of my wonderful grandma. My father asked if I wanted to ride with them from the service to the cemetery, and I obliged. The entire time, she wouldn't stop talking because she didn't want us to have a conversation. The pinnacle of her convoy was that she was going to get buried in a national military cemetery because of my father's high ranking. Okay then. I just smiled and nodded. We get back from the cemetery to the church for a luncheon with everyone in attendance. My father leaves the table for one moment to go to the bathroom, leaving us alone. She immediately turns to me and says, "You look different. You've gained a lot of weight. Are you pregnant?" Honestly, I've gained maybe 10 pounds since I've seen them 5 years ago, but I'm incredibly active and not overweight. Taken aback, I said, "Excuse me?" She then looked at me in the eye and slowly said, "Are you pregnant?" I was so saddened, I told her that was rude and excused myself. I went to sit next to my aunt and cousins and broke down. My father came back and she stormed up to him and started spewing and practically foaming at the mouth, guaranteed making up lies about me as she has done in the past. I saw him look down, then go around the room and said goodbye to everyone. Then he left. The whole family was undoubtedly pissed. He has 7 brothers and 3 sisters. We are a large French Catholic family that is very close, and he literally just left. I'm in my late 20s and have come to terms with losing my father, but I'm not going to lie, she cut into me and it worked. How I hate that git. Story 57. A few years ago, when we were 15, a friend of mine died. She'd been abused by her mother's partner as a child, and the mother stayed with the guy, so my friend and her younger sister ended up in foster care. The funeral was damn horrendous with the obvious rift between her biological family and foster family. I know where I stand on the matter. And the funeral celebrant seemed to be trying to bridge the gap for the sake of respect for my friend. But he kind of came across like he was way out of his depth and didn't really know what was happening. The whole thing was overly religious considering the sort of person my friend was, and I know she would have preferred to have her actual self celebrated for rather than the whole thing being made about, "Oh, but we lost our daughter, not you." You're the bad ones. We're the family. She deserved so much better in life and in death. I still mourn for that girl and the life she led. Story 58. My grandfather's brother's funeral kicked off the Great Tombstone debacle of 2009. My grandfather's brother, Sergei, was a hoser who never kept a steady job and drank a lot. He was also known for playing the banjo and supporting the Saskatchewan Rough Riders. After Sergei died, my grandfather and another of their brothers, Valerie, somehow ended up designing his tombstone. It has his name, a little picture of him, his date of birth and death, and a giant banjo with the Saskatchewan Rough Riders logo on it. Sergei's wife and kids did not approve of the banjo tombstone. No one else in the family liked it either. Once it came out that my grandfather and Valerie were responsible for this abomination, the non-tombstone approving family members ganged up on them, and it ended with a fist fight in the cemetery parking lot. Since then, the rest of the family has tried to remove the banjo tombstone. As far as I'm concerned, it's still there, and Sergei's wife is still mad at my grandfather and Valerie. Since my grandfather died, she's now taking her beef out on my grandmother, which is now playing out on Facebook. She also refused to attend Valerie's wife's funeral. Story 59. At my grandfather-in-law's funeral, my husband's mother is a saint, and I would gladly to kill her. I don't know where she got her sweetness from because it was clearly not from husband's grandmother, her mom. Her mother ditched all the kids with dad when they were babies, literally left them in his driveway, and disappeared. Over the years, my mother-in-law talks to her maybe once a year. So, her dad dies, the only parent who raised her and the only parent that showed her love. Her evil git of a mother had the balls to show up to the funeral to bask in the attention, and the first and only thing she says to my Mel was, "I need the death certificate so I can file for whatever benefits or retirement money he had," even though they had been divorced for 40-some-odd years and she had already remarried. My Mill was already in tears, and to say that to the daughter you abandoned while she was grieving, horrible. My husband had to physically restrain me because I wanted to knock her on her dusty ass. My family is always a trashy dumpster fire, but I guess every family has a few stray trash bags somewhere. Story 60. At the funeral of her young daughter, my friend's mom had her even younger daughter come up to me and ask if I would name the child I was pregnant with after her. Maybe this isn't that inappropriate, but it made me feel really put on the spot and heart-wrenching uncomfortable to have to explain to an 8-year-old why I couldn't name my baby after her suddenly gone big sister. The mother also took me aside to ask if her daughter died a virgin. In mom's defense, I think she was more than appropriately sedated to deal with the loss of her 15-year-old. I held nothing at all against her and understood she was mad with grief. It was just some stuff that made me feel uncomfortable in the moment. After said funeral and any and all memorials dedicated to the friend who was killed by a drunk driver, our group of friends kept going out to get plastered drunk to celebrate her life. Frankly, it was frigging disgusting and completely spit in the face of anything they should have learned from her untimely death. I was livid. I had a guy I grew up with use the funeral of a different childhood friend as an easy gathering place to carry out one of his 12 steps and get me, and for all I know some others, to forgive him for stuff. At my grandmother's funeral, my mom got up to speak and talked about what a horrible relationship they had, and basically how bad of a mother she was to her. I had to repeatedly motion for her to stop and walk away from the podium. It was that bad. Story 61, not one I've been to. If any of you are fans of the Dolan twins, you'll remember that when their father Sean passed away, a bunch of fans wanted to use this opportunity for a meet and greet. One even said that they were more affected than the twins themselves. Planning from fans eventually got so bad that the family had to hire private security to keep any uninvited visitors out. It made me seriously infuriated that people thought they could not only show up to the funeral of someone they never had any personal connection to, but that they wanted to use it as a meeting opportunity. Story 62. Not a funeral, but at the hospital when my grandfather was passing away, his brother and my uncle, his son, got into a fist fight over which generation was abused worse by their parents. They had to be escorted out by security. Story 63. My mom died at the end of last year. I have a large family, 7 siblings, 10 nibblings, that is spread from Alaska to Florida. I got married earlier the same year, and my wife finally got to meet my whole family at my mom's funeral. Only thing is, when she's nervous in social situations, she likes to high-five people she is comfortable with. Only me in this situation. Definitely the most high fives in one day for me. It just happened to be at my mom's funeral. Story 64. My grandmother's funeral. My entire family is gathered after the service and before the burial. As we are leaving for the cemetery, my sister wisely says we should leave our phones as well so there is no disturbance during the burial ceremony. We all agree. but I am told to keep mine with me as there is a babysitter looking after all the really young kids, and they should have a way to get in contact with us in case of emergency. Sounds good. Phone is on vibrate. If worst case happens, won't be that bad. Fast forward to the burial. Very somber, very nice service for a wonderful lady, and my cousins and I are now lowering our beloved grandmother into her eternal resting place when my ex decides to call asking for my Netflix password. Her custom ringtone of the chorus to Run to the Hills by Iron Maiden goes off as loud as my poor Nokia could muster. This as well as the fact that it was in my inner suit jacket pocket, defended by 2 buttons with my wool coat as the final layer to ensure my lasting embarrassment. Oh, and my hands were occupied lowering dear Granny Marge halfway down a dirt hole. The ringtone repeated 3 times before she hit bottom, and I could get a hand in to silence it. As I moved away from her plot and took my place with my family, my brother-in-law leaned towards me and whispered, "That was damn awesome." Story 65. Pastor gave an invitational during the funeral. An invitational when I was growing up in a Southern Baptist church was like an altar call. Did anyone want to come forward and be saved? Fine for the end of a sermon, tacky at a funeral. Story 66. I didn't witness this, but my grandma loves to tell me this story. It was the funeral for my grandma's mom, I believe. Apparently during the wake, they were sitting in a prayer circle, reading and singing and whatnot. During the middle of the prayer, my mom has a random arm spasm and just chucks her Bible into the middle of the circle. Everyone looked at her horrified. But my grandma's burst into uncontrollable laughter and eventually had to leave the room because she figured she shouldn't be laughing hysterically while her mom's casket was only a few feet away. Story 67. Not at the funeral, but fresh enough in my memory and incredibly inappropriate. My parents divorced when I was a toddler. Because of my mom's substances use, my dad got custody of us. But he didn't really know what he was doing as a single father to 2 young girls. So my dad's parents are really who raised us. My grandpa gave what should have been his years of relaxation to do everything for my sister and me. In the end, his hard work for us is probably why he left us so soon. I live 1,000 miles from my family. 12 hours after the man that raised me passed away, I hopped on a plane and flew home. I was greeted there by my sister, her fiancé, my brother, my mom's son, and my mother, higher than high. I never felt more angry or disgusted in my entire life. Story 68. My cousin Oded, don't do substances. It ducks your family up good when you die. The funeral was a crap show. My cousin's girlfriend chopped off a chunk of her hair and sprinkled it on his body. Not like cut off a lock and tie it in a bow. He looked like someone had let a cat roll over his corpse. Damn blonde hair everywhere. So then the speeches start. His stepfather gets up and starts preaching about how we have to talk to our kids about substances, etc., etc. We're at a funeral for an overdose buddy. It's a little late. Anyway, his 10-year-old daughter, the sister of the dead guy, is sitting in the front row. He starts talking about how the darkness overcame my cousin and how he had talked to his daughter about how he made her promise to never let the darkness get her. He says, girl's name, "Promise me you'll never let the darkness get you." She meekly mumbles, "I promise," and he screams at her, "Louder!" So she says it a little louder. I was horrified for her. Then he said that the slogan of his new anti-drug campaign is, "To wait is too late." And now my brother and I use that for anything and everything because it's hands down the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Story 69. I attended the funeral for the daughter of an older lady I knew from church. Unfortunately, there was a lot of drama with her and her extended family. For some reason, they still thought it'd be a good idea to do an open mic time for anyone to share stories about the woman who had died. At first it was civil, but then it just turned into a family member bash fest. The funeral officiant didn't really do anything to stop it, and family members just got up there and started yelling profanity and casting blame on each other. I'm surprised a fight didn't break out. People in the back actually started booing. It was the most awkward and inappropriate thing I've ever witnessed at a funeral. Story 70. At my sister's funeral, there was someone there who was an old friend, but not very close to her. She was talking to me outside and went on a rant about how angry she was that more people didn't show up. It was mostly my family, her boyfriend's family, and a few friends who she had always kept contact with. What more could you ask for? I just felt like this person wanted something to complain about, but it was in really bad taste, IMO. Story 71. Not my story, my father's. He was at a funeral. They were walking around the cemetery. Apparently, one of the guests had pre-purchased a plot at the same cemetery and was pointing it out excitedly to my father and my uncle during the procession. My dad said my uncle leaned over to him and whispered, "Why doesn't he crawl in right now?" Story 72. This will probably get buried, but I was a funeral director for a while before I decided to pursue another career. I've seen fistfights, people knocking over caskets, people trying to climb into the casket grave with their loved one. I even had a man hit on me while we were standing 2 feet away from his dead mother. People do weird things when they're grieving. Story 73. I was 5. My great-grandmother had died from old age, and for some reason it was a closed casket funeral. From what my mom told me, my great-grandmother hadn't been into wearing makeup when she was alive, and she definitely wouldn't wear it as a corpse. One of my relatives, probably about the same age as I but more used to open casket funerals, wondered why they couldn't see the corpse. I commented in my innocence that she's bones now. That was one way to break the ice at an awkward funeral. Story 74. At my father's funeral, at 20 years old, a friend of a friend attended and proceeded to use the event as a way of ingratiating himself and desperately trying to get a friend something I can presume was difficult for him. During the receiving line, an already awful process where the family of the deceased line up to have everyone awkwardly say something to them. He stepped to my side and proceeded to have a side conversation with me while friends and coworkers of my father said things to me. In this totally inappropriate side conversation where others had to wait for him to finish or where he occasionally interjected with how nice and such, he said, "Hey, I've got a soccer game later today. You should come and watch." Sad, really, but yeah, totally damn inappropriate. There's one day, a life when I don't want to be the kind of person who feels sorry for this poor dude, and that's at my father's funeral. Story 75. At my grandfather's funeral, the family all debated over whether my grandmother should be at the funeral home visitation, as she had Alzheimer's, and it might upset her or she wouldn't understand. They decided to bring her. All day she greeted guests, would show them her dear Clyde and how much she would miss him. She would get to talking, and then look over at the casket and realize that it was him in there, and then get surprised that it was him, and go into how much she was going to miss him. It was actually adorable because she wasn't too upset for long and helped the other family members forget their grief for a moment. When it came time for the minister to do a service, it was very quiet for a moment, and you could hear tiny grandma's voice, "Where's Clyde?" That he always hated to go to church. It might have been inappropriate, but we all laughed through our tears. I missed them both so much. Story 76 was at a funeral of my boss. One of our alcoholic coworkers proceeded to show up drunk. He insulted the man being laid to rest, the big boss of the whole company. He then slapped across the face while he's stumbling and falling over. He then complimented the big boss's wife and kissed her dead on the lips. He barely had any clothes on at all, and it was just very embarrassing for our company, himself, and the man being laid to rest. The next day, he called into work and quit calling the timekeeper a thundergit, excuse the profanity. Story 77. I went to a family member's funeral when I was 11 years old. He had took his own life, and I didn't know that. I was in line behind my evil aunt, who casually lifted the collar to his shirt and commented to her friend, "Wow, they did a great job with the makeup. You can't even tell he hung himself." Story 78. Inappropriate, but not cruel or mean. My grandma cried with genuine tears and passion about how good of a lover my grandpa was and how much he liked to have sex. I felt sad for her, but also trying my absolute best to not burst out in laughter. Story 79. At grandfather's funeral, Reverend talks such a shame that country is divided. Next words out of his mouth, just like they say in those songs. Maybe should have called the guy on it because never has dawned on him that he is the problem. Story 80. My cousin was drunk and or high and threw up on a man in his military uniform whites. She lied and told my mom that I had put something in her water. I was 6. My mom believed her despite knowing for a fact my cousin was a massive coke head at the time, and despite the fact that I was 6 and had no means of obtaining anything to put into someone's drink. Story 81. At my mom's funeral, her high school best friend, who is the worst type of person, 53 and still living with her father, was married to a con artist and swears she's God's gift to earth, who hadn't spoken to my mom in at least 5 years, started rumors that she had overdosed on medications and died from that. To people she didn't know, when she hadn't been asked to come to her funeral. Story 82. When I was 13, my aunt, my dad's sister, died in a terrible car accident, which my uncle and cousin were also in and survived. My aunt and mom were best friends, so, naturally, I was also very close with her. At the funeral, I sobbed, especially when we all sang Amazing Grace. My aunt was the first death I had experienced in my family. My stepmother pulled me aside, in the cemetery immediately after the service, to tell me that my crying was totally inappropriate and yelled at me to calm down. Damn that lady. Story 83. My father's funeral. My family is white, and my brother is adopted. He's Puerto Rican. We were in line, accepting everyone's condolences. One man came up to him and looked him up and down and said, "Who are you?" My brother responded, "I'm his son." "Who are you?" We also had a woman who came up to me and sobbed on my shoulder while I comforted her. I asked how long she knew him. She got hired at his work 3 weeks earlier. Told her I was sorry for her loss. Funerals are weird. Story 84. When I was 9 and my brother was 5, our great uncle died. On the way to the visitation, my parents were explaining death to my brother. When we arrived, my brother ran behind the casket and yelled, "That guy is dead!" No one knew if they should laugh or not. The great uncle was named Aura, and he was a damn sailor who was covered from head to toe in tattoos, and he chain smoked himself right into his casket shortly before his 4th wife joined him. No question, he would have found it hilarious. Story 85. Just before spreading their mom's ashes, the daughter stuck her finger in the jar, scooped some up, and ate it. I tried to play it off like it wasn't the weirdest thing I just witnessed, but my wife said out loud, why? To which she replied, "I wanted to see what my mom tastes like, kind of bland and crunchy." Story 86. My uncle was a pretty big alcoholic/crafty person in general. He was working in construction when he died, and some of his friends' junkies he knew from his job came to his funeral uninvited. One of the guys came wearing sweatpants and sipping a bottle of Jack Daniels. I asked him to leave. He refuses, then my brother-in-law and I forcibly remove him. He proceeded to peel out in the parking in his busted-up '92 Corvette and blast his horn before leaving. Story 87, talking about how the deceased has been accused of murder back in the '70s. Then took their time telling the story behind it before getting to rather important part of he was acquitted, and the murder is still an open case mystery. For a few minutes, I thought I was giving honors to a damn murderer. Story 88. Well, my grandmother tried pulling my grandfather's coffin out of the hearse like 3 times. She spent the ceremony itself crying and rolling around on the floor, and she nearly knocked over the coffin, the bloody bint. Necessary backstory because people will say she was just grieving. No, the woman hated my grandfather. Theirs was an arranged marriage, and she only threw grieving performances when there was an audience. Story 89. In high school, my friend's GF showed up to his beloved, highly respected conservative grandfather's funeral in a cheetah print bodycon with her tits out, and threw a fit when he rode to the lunch afterwards in with his family instead of us.